So, before we go ahead and wrap up the lecture here, I want you guys to think about all the possibilities post-flop. Because, in my opinion, the play and all streets are related. And what I've done here is list the 8 possibilities to see showdown. Let's say you raise pre-flop right on the button. You can either bet the flop, lines are bet, 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 3 streets of value, bet, bet, check, 2 streets of value, bet, check, bet, also 2 streets, bet, check, 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 bet, bet, check, bet, check, check, bet, and check, check, check. Now that sounds very confusing because I just said it. However, think about the different hands that would go into each of these scenarios, right? What hands would we bet, bet, bet with for value? Well, we would be betting top pair, top kicker, and the nuts. Potentially, we might be 3-barreling, a misdraw of some kind, but more often than not, we're going to be betting with a strong hand. At the same time, the same thing your opponent too. Most of the time, your opponent's going to be betting a strong hand. I underlined bet, flop, bet, turn, check, river because I have a feeling this is going to be our most common betting lines and betting scenario. It allows us to get value from when we're ahead, take a free showdown if we want to, and also if we improve on the river, we can bet 3 streets, go for the value like we did in the first, we call it bet line. We just talked about the bet, check, bet line, and how does our range proceed? What would we put into there? Right? We would bet flop with marginal value hands. Same thing for we would see bet bluff. Right? We would check the turn on hands that we would be bluffing with. I'm sorry, we can't bluff again on the turn, and also some more marginal hands, maybe inducing a river bet. And then what hands would we bet the river with? Well, we would be value betting the river. Some of the more hands, some of the second pair, top pair type hands we took behind the flop with, as well as some bluffs, right? If like a draw missed and your opponent's very weak, and he will check fold to us on the river, then we can take the bet, check, bet, bluff line. I don't usually recommend taking the bet, check, bet, bluff line because people call that very wide, and it allows us to bet, check, bet for value much wider. So I would use that line for value more often than I would for a bluff. The bet, check, check is usually going to be left for like air on the flop, right? And you've turned some kind of showdownable hand, right? Or just giving up, period. So there's very hard for you to have a strong hand when you bet, check, check. So those are the betting on the flop lines. Now there's also the lines where you've checked the flop. As you can see, it's impossible for us to get 3 streets of value when we check the flop, right? It's actually very obvious. So therefore, if we never get 3 streets of value when we check the flop, then it's nearly impossible for us to have any kind of nut hand going to the turn, because why would we check the flop with a nut hand when we could be value betting it out? Same thing for your opponent, right? If they check the flop, they probably don't have the nuts. And so when we check the flop and then bet the turn, we're representing some kind of made hand that wasn't strong enough to bet the flop with, but is now strong enough to bet the turn. Something like maybe we turned top pair, turned middle pair, maybe we turned 2 pair, or we maybe turned some kind of draw to go with that. We check flop, bet turn, bet river. Again, we're almost representing that we have the nuts on the turn instead of the flop, or more polarized bluffing. Usually, like the check flop, bet turn, bet river line, in my opinion, when our opponent does it, is a very weak line, and one of the lines that you can pick off bluffs on very thinly, because it doesn't make any sense that your opponent would check behind the flop with like top pair, so he must have turned something very strong. Check bet check line is probably going to be used for value more than a bluff. I would recommend not firing 1 barrel on the turn when you're bluffing. So you should be using the check bet bet line if you're checking behind the flop or delayed c-betting it out. Check bet check is kind of weak in my opinion when you're doing it as a bluff, but you can go for pretty thin value. You're going to get called once you check the flop pretty widely on the turn, and I guess that's a common theme where like when you check an earlier street, expect to get called wider on the next street. Alright, so let's go, and then there's like check, check, bet. That's actually a really weird like value line. Maybe if you rivered some kind of like top pair or something like that, or maybe you like flopped second or third pair and then you turned. The turn paired the board and you still couldn't get any value out of it, but maybe on the river it improved your hand somewhat and you can go for very thin value. keep in mind, like, all of these bets are probably going to be very small, especially whenever you're bluffing. You don't want to be making it very large. You want to keep the pot small, then therefore you have more maneuverability when you are making the bet size. And one thing I guess I didn't mention here in an earlier thread is that when we do raise pre-flop, we are making it a 3x raise size by default, and then perhaps in a later video, in my miscellaneous or extras video, I'll talk about reasons to both decrease and increase the raise size accordingly.